In the early 21st century, the stakes became more important and the action more dramatic, when the historical orthodoxy of the Great Depression passed from academic minds into the policy sphere. Some sense of what was to come was in evidence at a celebration of Milton Friedman's 90th birthday in 2002. By then, Bernanke was a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, and in an off-cited tribute, he said, "I would like to say to Milton and Anna, regarding the Great Depression, you're right, we did it. We're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again." Bernanke's words surely gave the nonagenarian as much pause as pleasure. Only a few years after a monetarist history publication, Friedman had worried that we are in danger of assigning to monetary policy a larger role than it can perform. He and Schwartz had lacerated the Fed for its inaction in the early 1930s, but he was adamant that bolder action by central bankers was not the lesson to be learned from history. To the contrary, Friedman claimed that monetary policy should be maintained within tight constraints to limit the discretion of central bankers, on the grounds that time and time again, they show a propensity to overreact. Now, it's hardly surprising that some readers drew rather different implications from a monetary history, but Friedman could hardly have imagined what Bernanke would dare when the opportunity presented itself. As chairman of the Federal Reserve System when the financial crisis broke in 2008-2009, Bernanke showed his determination not to do it again by proposing aggressive policies of monetary expansion to pump unprecedented amounts of liquidity into the financial system. Friedman may not have been around to witness what Helicopter Ben did in his name, but Schwartz pulled no punches to say that Bernanke is right about the past, but that he is fighting the wrong war today. The present crisis has nothing to do with the lack of liquidity. Undeterred by his mentor's criticism, Bernanke plowed on with his liquidity injections, and other central bankers soon followed suit. In the process, quantitative easing went from an unconventional and disreputable proclivity of the Japanese central bank to the new normal for rich countries' monetary authorities. The flood of liquidity into capitalism's financial system was remarkable in historical perspective, surpassing all previous records for monetary interventions since the beginning of the 20th century. Notwithstanding the boldness of their actions in the global financial crisis, central bankers enjoyed the support of many respectable economists and economic historians. The logic they employ is limpid in Barry Eichengreen's recent admonishing of critics of quantitative easing. Absent this support from advanced country central banks following the global financial crisis, a debilitating deflation might have set in and the post-crisis recession would have been more severe. The verb tenses are italicized to highlight the resurgence of historical fiction. Quantitative easing was justified with the historical fiction about a Great Depression that did not have to happen if the central bank had acted effectively. Its effectiveness in 2008-2009 was evaluated based on another counterfactual argument about a Great Depression that would have happened if central banks had not acted decisively. Now it seems we are writing a trilogy, with the third volume of historical fiction set in 2020-2021 in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic. In the face of the pandemic, economist Kenneth Rogoff claimed that with each passing day, the 2008 global financial crisis increasingly looks like a mere dry run for today's economic catastrophe. The short-term collapse in global output now underway already seems likely to rival or exceed that of any recession in the last 150 years. One wonders what he means by this last sentence until he evokes the possible repercussions of a global depression. Nouriel Roubini went further still to suggest a greater depression. Once again, the main character from the preceding volume of the trilogy stepped in to add a bit of edge, with Bernanke reprising Schwartz in claiming this is a very different animal from the Great Depression. It is much closer to a major snowstorm or a natural disaster than it is to a classic 1930s style depression. It's quite different, and different tools are necessary. Still, Bernanke made it clear that quantitative easing was one of those necessary tools, and he praised Fed Chairman Powell and his team for being extremely proactive. Bernanke's remarks hint at the irony involved in the mobilization of past economic crises for dealing with crises in the present. The monetarist interpretation of an economic crisis that occurred almost a century ago has become the unquestioned foundation of policies for dealing with economic crises today. However, the way that interpretation is being used undermines a fundamental premise of the monetarism of Milton, Friedman, and Schwartz. After all, when the world's central bankers so readily make money, and more of it, the illusion of money's sanctity is shattered. One might be tempted to declare the shattering of another foundational premise for Friedman and Schwartz. Surely there was no denying capitalism's inherent instability in the face of a financial crisis that emanated from the core of the capitalist system, as it did in 2008-2009. In fact, denial was precisely the order of the day, as the crisis was cast as a liquidity crisis, just as the Great Depression had been. This illusion serves as a buffer against any pressure to interpret economic turbulence as a symptom of structural characteristics of capitalism that need to be reformed or overcome. It is what Americans might call a shit happens theory of economic crisis. Shit happens. It might be a banking panic, a massive snowstorm, an earthquake, maybe even a virus pandemic. It causes a liquidity crisis. We pump liquidity in, and the crisis is over. So there has been no shattering of the premise of capitalism's stability, but rather an undermining of its opponent through the depletion of our capacity to understand economic crises. Not only are economic crises evacuated of any diagnostic meaning about the character of capitalism, but we become fatalistic about dealing with them. However the capitalist system fails us, whether in the actions it fosters or fails to encourage, we will shore it up with massive and sustained injections of fresh money. In 2008-2009, capitalism failed us by creating a financial maelstrom that threatened to engulf us. In 2020, the structural limits of capitalism can be seen as much in the medieval practices on which we depend to protect our health as the intense anxiety about the economy's fragility. But rather than acknowledging and attacking these failures and limits, we shore them up with monetary largesse. More than 50 years ago, Friedman worried about the impression that government must step in to keep capitalism on an even keel. What is more chilling today is that a monetary history's interpretation of the Great Depression has been mobilized to allow the world's central banks to become capitalism's keel.